It is Friday, September 20th. Let's talk PlayStation. Alright, so we have a lot of PlayStation news to go over. It was a pretty busy week. In fact, the games industry as a whole, a lot of discussions going on, so we'll try to get through this in a somewhat reasonable manner, but no promises. So we'll start with that PlayStation Plus reminder for the month of September 2019. It is Darksiders 3 and Batman Arkham Knight. You have plenty of time to grab these games, like 2 weeks left really, or add them to your library, which you should. Now I want to dial back to LTPS last week because we had a rumor about a PlayStation event alongside The Last of Us Part 2 event, which would take place September 24th. Turns out that rumor was 100% true. Sony has announced a new state of play that will take place on the same exact day, September 24th, which is interesting. It will be 1 p.m. PST or 4 p.m. EST. It will include new game announcements, new content from Sony's worldwide studios, new general updates is what they're saying, and it will include a fresh new look, which I find also kind of odd because we've only had like 2 state of plays so far, so I'm okay with them transitioning away from what little we've really experienced so far. They're hinting that there's possibly going to be an on-screen personality, which I think might be Sid Schumann from what he said on Twitter, but that's fine. I think the show does need an on-screen personality, give it a little more flavor instead of the stoic voiceovers from those stylized transitions, but the state of play is coming, so it looks like we'll get some updates. Now, what will be in it? Well, that's a good segue into our next news story about that Last of Us Part 2 event, which is that we're hearing, and these are rumors, mind you, not confirmed from Sony or Naughty Dog, but that it's about a 3-hour gameplay, hands-on gameplay demonstration with the media, and it will include, we don't necessarily know, right? It could be single-player content, could be multiplayer, but it's 3 hours of hands-on time. Now, understanding that Sony never actually gave us a press release about this, and we heard about it from Jeff Keighley, kind of implies that this isn't going to be something that's applicable to the public, right? This is something that's behind closed doors, technically, where Sony's going to control how much information is released, whoever's present at the event, obviously going to be signing some NDAs about what they can and can't talk about. So I think what we might be expecting with State of Play, perhaps, and this is a theory of course, but considering we're getting a State of Play the same day as this Last of Us event, I would imagine there's some sort of slight tie in there, where the State of Play will show us what they're planning on showing us, and then the media gets their actual hands-on time, and it will line up accordingly with not only that new footage, whatever they decide to tell us about The Last of Us Part 2 in the State of Play, which I would hope is a release date, or maybe it is a close look at multiplayer content. Whatever small slice is going to be included in it, because the State of Play is going to be about 20 minutes long, and that's including other announcements. So surely if The Last of Us Part 2 is a part of it, it's only going to be 3, 4, 5 minutes long at the most. So that's the small slice they're going to show us. Media gets 3 hours of hands-on time to elaborate further on what the public was shown. So that seems to make the most sense to me, and we'll see if that ends up being true. And mind you, I will be there on September 24th watching the State of Play. I'll get a video up right away talking to you guys about what happened, basically recapping it, and some general impressions. So I think we'll actually do that in place of another Tuesday video. I don't, not to have 2 uploads at one point. Now, the other news story about The Last of Us Part 2 is that it will be at the Madrid Games Week 2019, and that's taking place from October 3rd to October 6th. But we're also being told that while it is there, it's behind closed doors, nothing for the public, and not playable on the show floor or anything like that. That's where we're at right now with that game and State of Play. Now, next up, our headline and news story about PlayStation 5. This is a pretty big deal. This rumor came out just yesterday, and this rumor is suggesting that Sony is aiming for a PS5 standard console and then a PS5 Pro immediately during its presumed 2020 launch. This rumor is coming from Japanese journalist Zenji Nishikawa. He casually mentions it during a live stream of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, he is a journalist. He's gotten a few things correct in the past, and it's not necessarily him predicting things, but due to his connections and the fact that he's based in Japan, so he's working very closely with some of his sources and some of the people that are close to these Japanese companies, which is inherently Sony and Nintendo. His rumors before suggesting a PS4 Pro and Nintendo Switch Lite as of recent has turned out to be true. So that's why we're kind of looking at this and thinking, okay, he's certainly got a connection here, a source here that may be implying that this is something that Sony's looking at and that they're aiming to do. During the live stream, and he's speaking in Japanese, of course, but the auto-translate does a pretty decent job of understanding the point he's getting across, and native speakers have corroborated this as well, that what how Sony's looking at this right now is like the iPhone, for example, is a piece of hardware which today can come out with multiple SKUs and people understand the differences between them loosely and they're okay with it and they're not necessarily confused about it, which is a good explanation as to looking at the console industry in the past, which is that usually 2 SKUs at launch aren't all that favorable. Sony did it with the PS3, didn't work out. Microsoft did it with Xbox 360, didn't work out. Nintendo did it with the Wii U, didn't work out. Usually these base SKUs get cut off because consumers usually in that time frame, mind you, weren't too thrilled about buying a lesser console, so they weren't always very popular, and they were dropped off immediately by the manufacturer. But perhaps times are different now. That's where I'm standing right now. I'm kind of looking at both scenarios here in terms of if this is or is not true. I can really see both ways. Initially, I saw this and I thought, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because of how Sony handled PS4 Pro, which PS4 Pro, great naming scheme. I mean, it's a great nomenclature that conveys to consumers, this is a souped-up PS4. I don't think it's confused the market in any way. They had a bit of an uphill PR battle announcing the thing, but once it came out, people understand it. It's a low-volume machine. It sells, from what we're still hearing and what we're told, it's a 1 in 5 PS4 sale, basically, is a PS4 Pro. And that's fine. It works great for the market. Sony did it halfway into the PS4 life cycle to compete with the relevance of PC today, so it's a more souped-up console that people can get prettier graphics out of if they still want the console experience, and it's worked well. I think a lot of people have really been okay with that. But, does it make sense to release that simultaneously right off the jump? I mean, now maybe times have changed, because that very much is the thing where history has shown us multiple SKUs and consoles doesn't work. But it's been a while now, that technically has been over a decade ago. I know a lot of people like to look at history and think just because it was this way before means it's going to be this way coming up. We all know that's not true. We'd be lying to ourselves if we thought that was the case. So maybe that's how Sony sees it, and they do want to do that immediately, late 2020 when they launch these machines. The thing is, what's difficult for me to digest here is that PS5 as a standard console, from what the rumors have been suggesting, is that it might launch at a $499 price tag, which is not a bad thing. Most consumers seem to be pretty okay with that. Just anecdotally from reading online, a bunch of surveys where the results are out of a few thousand people are saying that they're actually okay with spending $500 on a console nowadays. Again, it's been 10 years. It's not the same as 2006. $500 today is not the same as $500 10 years ago. So that's fine, but if that's the standard console, what are you going to price the next one at? $600? Now that's a bit of a stretch. And have consumers change to that point where they're okay with buying a standard PS5 and not buying a PS5 Pro? What does and that's the thing. PS5 Pro is not going to inherently be much different at all. I mean, maybe it might have a different case, a different shell. It's going to have a higher clock speed, but we haven't had any rumors about that so far. So I don't think it's outside the realms to suggest we're not getting a PS5 Pro at some point. Of course, that's kind of what we were expecting, to get a PS5 in 2020, then a PS5 Pro, say 2023 would probably make the most sense. But realistically, all things considered, as much as I can look at this being true, there's still way too much playing against it that I'm not buying just yet. Consumers are okay with a base model and a Pro model, but right off the jump, it's just not a good look. One's going to be, $600-700? And then you're playing yourself short for the PS5 generation as a whole. What do you do 3 years in? That was the point of PS4 Pro, to continue the PS4 life cycle or offer a slight upgrade. Even though PS4 Pro was a low-volume machine, and you'd say, okay, PS5 is going to be a low-volume machine as well, that's fine, but you're playing yourself short. PS5 Pro is only going to be so good in late 2020. At some point, 2023, there's going to be something far beyond PS5 Pro. At that point, why don't you just wait, do your standard PS5, then do your PS5 Pro, much like this console generation has played out. Now, some people are looking at the angle of, well, I'm a power user right away. I'd rather just buy one PS5, and that's the one I want, which would be the Pro model. I mean, at that point, do you just do a spec bump to both platforms 3 years in? Because you've already released both your hardware right off the jump, so, I mean, what do? You can't call it PS5 Pro 2, PS5 Pro Pro. That's weird. Your naming scheme's out the door at that point. You would have to keep the names of the machines the same and then just internally update them 3 years down the road and disclose that to the public that, hey, there's a new PS4 Pro model out there that may look the same, or maybe it does have a different shell, a different casing. I guess that would be their one way to skirt around the idea that the name's the same but the hardware is internally different. So maybe you could do that, but is that what you explore to try to convey to the consumer that, yes, it's still a PS4 Pro, the name's the same, but this is much better hardware than what it was in late 2020? Do you also do that to the base model, which I think would probably be good to do, but that also complicates matters a bit for developers to where they're now making games that could scale to 4 different levels of hardware at that point. So it's just, there's too much, like I said, there's too much playing against the rumor right now. Based on some of the rumors we've had so far, we've looked at 4chan ones, Pastebin ones, and some of those did end up being true, like the ones from Pastebin. The 4chan ones really starting to crumble now. but the source of this one, you know, it's not to be overlooked. So I think that's where we'll leave this one for now. All right, I know we spent a lot of time on that one, so moving on. Sony also recently announced that they have confirmed that their acquisition of Insomniac does include all their past IP, including Sunset Overdrive. So this story is making the rounds, and a lot of people are discussing bringing Sunset Overdrive back. There's really not much else to say. We discussed this in the Insomniac video. It was pretty much implied that they got their past work, and it's good to see that we've got a confirmation of that. But Sony even said that they're looking forward into future titles, and that would imply the next Spider-Man, the next Ratchet & Clank. Don't hold out your breath for Sunset. Moving on, Nico Partners analyst Daniel Ahmad posted on Twitter that PS4 sales in the US have reached 30 million units, which is incredible. That implies that we're looking at a nearly almost third of PS4s are sold in the US, which is incredible. It's a lot of consoles in one territory, but I mention this because it highlights the importance of what we've been talking about before when it comes to the trade story, the tariff story about this potential 25% tariff on consoles coming into the US from China. This is how important the US market is. So at 30 million units, this is something that Sony's not going to play lightly with when it comes to compromising or jeopardizing their hold in this market. So it's just something to look at. It's something to think about. If the tariff goes through, it's going to be bad for, well, I don't want to say it's going to be bad for Sony, but they're going to have to approach it in a different manner for sure. Now, Sony's Worldwide Studios president Shuhei Yoshida was doing a lot of interviews this past week. You know, it's funny, he's been pretty quiet as of recent. We haven't had many quotes from him. It's been a lot of Jim Ryan, a lot of Kenichiro Yoshida, but Shuhei was pretty busy this past week, so we got some quotes and interviews to share from him. One thing being that he mentioned that Ghost of Tsushima, whenever he goes to play it, he says that it looks so beautiful and it just blows him away. So he was quoted as saying, "When I play it, it's so beautiful that my hands stop. There are many scenes that make Japanese scenery 1.2 times more beautiful." I love how oddly specific he's being. No, it's not 2 times better. It's not way better. It's just only slightly better than real Japanese scenery, which is, of course, ridiculous, but that's Shuhei saying that, hey, this game looks really, really good. And it does. I mean, when we first saw footage of Ghost of Tsushima, it did look incredible, and everyone somewhat immediately was like, okay, this has got to be a cross-gen title, which no doubt it probably is. Another thing he mentioned this past week was that they might acquire Asian developers in the future. It's not outside the realms of possibility that that could happen. He didn't elaborate too much on this, but rather just, you know, we've got all these different markets, we've got all these different communities that we're looking at, and acquiring an Asian developer for Asian markets is not, it's something that could happen in the future. Another thing he mentioned was about VR and how it's still in its infancy and that there's still a lot to do. So one quote there, he said, "I think that the hardware experience will improve the VR experience. VR has a lot to learn, even at companies that have been making games for a long time. I realized that as soon as I started VR. I had to learn a lot because I couldn't do it with normal TV games. But we do have many guidelines for danger. But with developers' ingenuity, we were able to see how to do it, and VR makes us think about what the human abilities are. And after 3 years, such knowledge is growing." Not at all surprising words from Shuhei. I mean, Sony in general, we know that they're very supportive of VR, but when you follow Shuhei on Twitter and you see that he's always retweeting VR developers, tweeting back to VR developers, showcasing new trailers, all the awards that Astrobot Rescue Mission gets, we know that he tours all the worldwide studios and he's the head of, you know, that operation, but I think he's much more hands-on with VR and much more involved with VR than I think a lot of people see or give him credit for, which is always good news. Now, another thing the company is very committed to, and Shuhei commented on this as well, is Dreams, but we're getting a better idea of what Sony really has in plans for Dreams, which is that they're hoping it's got a 10-year life cycle with their broader idea for the project and what they can flourish and create with the community. So this, I think, paints a much bigger picture of what Sony's been doing with Dreams, because to be honest, I've been questioning it a lot lately. You know, we've got the early access, which hasn't been drumming much interest. I know there's a lot of feedback with, you know, Media Molecule in the community, what works, what doesn't work. Media Molecule's been, you know, pretty open about what they want to do and what they've been looking into, possibly bringing on outside, you know, people from the games industry, working closely with the studio to create content, which we assumed was single-player content, but then also there's this talk of allowing creators to monetize their content, which might seem like a stretch, but it's really not when you look at some of the work that people have been doing. I mean, you've got full-on development cycles in Dreams. You've got people that are doing so much in Dreams because it actually takes that much time. You've got people spending weeks on just one character model. And you've got one-man shows creating full-scale projects, or you've got multi-people projects creating content in Dreams to release one big-scale project. And again, it's all in Dreams. So I think this gives us a much better idea now that, yes, this game's totally going to be on PS4 for a long time. It's going to come to PS5 at some point with a native release, even though it's backwards compatible, but it'll get a native release. I've been on record to say this title would actually make a lot of sense to come to PC at some point to reach to a wider audience, and it makes a lot of sense for PC as a platform because it is such an open platform where people can create their content and move it around and share it. So the game's inherently based off community, but I think this game is starting to walk away from the traditional $60 release, which we were told was still going to happen, with a full story mode, a more feature set amount of content that somebody can go to a store and buy or download from PSN and just experience it that way. But now it looks like something much different, which is not a bad thing. To be honest, I think that's probably their best course of action to see a return on this thing, because they've been spending a lot of time on it. Media Molecule has. And when Media Molecule spends a lot of time on it, that's Sony spending a lot of time on it. So they need to do something with it, and this looks like where they're going. Now, since Let's Talk PlayStation has been on the outskirts of TGS from its starting and ending, we also have some updates on Final Fantasy VII Remake. Well, we got a lot of footage from that and Death Stranding. We'll get to that in a second, but we will mention this one thing that came out for Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is that there is a classic mode. The classic mode being, obviously it's an ATB, active time battle system. It's very action-oriented and focused. We've seen the footage. We know that it's dramatically different from what we've seen from the original game, and that's... Some people are really happy about that. Some people are upset that it's not your traditional turn-based combat. Well, the classic mode is supposed to alleviate that, give purists a way to play the game, but not necessarily. So if you watch the footage, it's very automated. I mean, you can't... Inherently, when they say, classic modes bring turn-based combat back, you already know that's a bit of a stretch, because the game inherently was designed around this new action-focused combat. The entire areas, landscapes, the way you enter rooms and have enemies approach you, I mean, it's entirely different, right? So obviously it wasn't going to be classic turn-based, but what this does, it automates a lot of the actions. You sit there with the controller not doing much of anything. Then at some point the game will give you an option to do a more specialized attack, use an item, use magic, something to that effect, right? It's not your traditional turn-based. It's not what we were expecting from the original game. So, I enjoy the effort to try and offer something like that. I understand that you can't really do that, though. So, I don't know. This seems kind of half-baked, and it's like you can't really do much more, because I know it would take a substantial amount of work to actually turn it into what the game was originally like. They're too far gone. They can't really go back and do that. If they did, that'd be impressive, but that seems like a lot of money to invest into what will be one game with two completely different play styles. It's not really in their best interest to pursue something like that. They've already made the decision to go one way. They're sticking to it. That's fine. I don't think this mode's really going to do much for people. I think a lot of people saw this and thought, oh yes, that's awesome, now I can play it the way I want, but you're going to be disappointed to find out that's not really what you were expecting. Now, with Death Stranding, we got a lot more footage. We got some look at the safe rooms. We got English translations from the Japanese gameplay demo, so that's all good. We're not going to talk about that here. If you want to see those things, I suggest that you go look into it a little bit further, but the one thing we will mention is Kojima talking about the possibility of a sequel. So, he was quoted as saying, "I'm not really sure. When this game comes out, there will be a lot of pros and cons, and these elements could become the essence of the core part, but I think it's better that I keep it going in a sequel." He elaborated further saying, yeah, probably at least 1.5 and then 2, maybe, at least so that it remains and people are aware of the genre. There are a lot of other projects that come up like TV dramas and things like that. A lot of pitches come my way. Why I can't say it's definite is because I only have one body and there are many projects that I have to be involved with, and it's really tough for me to physically do many things at once. I mean, hell, just last week he did mention that they're starting the very early process of the next project, and based on the way he's talking here, it doesn't sound like that new project is Death Stranding unless he's smart enough to catch himself from what he's been saying recently, not to hint that it is a Death Stranding 1.5 or a full-on sequel. But if it were to be more Death Stranding, I'd imagine what he's referring to, 1.5. And that would be the whatever version we get on PlayStation 5 and PC in late 2020, which we're still expecting. Now, E3 2020. This was also a pretty big news story this past week, not just PlayStation focused, but pretty important nonetheless. Sony skipped E3 2019. Now, if you haven't really been following the E3 news, we don't discuss it too much here, but You know, the ESA and E3 has really been on a downward spiral. It's not like it was 10 years ago where it was an actual trade show for retailers. Now it's been, you know, it's entirely different now, where it's very much for the consumer. It's the hardware manufacturers making their case for why their products are good, why their games are good, why these games need to sell. You know, they're not there really doing business deals anymore. It still takes place, but it's just not like that anymore. So there's always been this conversation the past few years about what E3 will turn into. Well, the ESA has outlined that for E3 2020, and that it will be more of a festival-like experience. They're talking about bringing 10,000 more gamer badges in, so making it more of a public event than it was already, which they started in 2017, focusing on a younger generation, so millennials, Gen Z, bringing on more influencers, more gameplay demos, trying to figure out a system so that there's not long wait times or so that there's things to do while you're waiting in line. They understand that more publishers have been leaving the event or doing their announcements on their own, so this is kind of what they're evolving into, which the only thing that really surprises me about this is not necessarily that they're doing it, but rather that they're doing it for E3 2020. I felt like for sure E3 was going to have one more really powerful year, which would be 2020, because that's the important one, right? That's why we've been saying Sony's not going to be at E3 2019. They have nothing to show. Surely when we see more of PlayStation 5 and Microsoft shows us more of the next Xbox, we're going to have a substantial E3 2020. It's going to be the same thing as E3 2013, where it was, you know, all in, guns blazing, brand new hardware, brand new generation games. I mean, that was a big deal, 2013. It was a big show. I think a lot of us don't forget that. And so 2020 was going to be like the last major show, I feel, where Sony was obviously going to, you know, show up at that point, because they have to bring PlayStation 5 stuff and really give us some more details about that. Same with Microsoft. I mean, that's really all it is, right? You know, one more year of relevance, and then 2021, 2022, that's when they're really going to have a bit of a problem on their hands of trying to stay relevant as Sony does more state of plays. You know, as Microsoft, they have their Xbox shows every once in a while that they do. There's other shows that are much larger and have a lot more foot traffic, like Gamescom, TGS, Paris Games Week. You know, there's things going on. The industry's changing. The ESA has to change too. I just didn't think it would be this soon, quite honestly. So that's surprising to me. So looks like even now, E3 2020 may not be as important as it would have been prior. Now, I could talk more about this, but I know it's getting long. So our final news story, the GameStop redesign has been shown off. So one store posted on Facebook that their redesign has gone through. They're open for business, and this is what it looks like. This is one of the redesigns that's focused on the retro community style. So you walk in, it's a very clean layout. It's more monotone with a single color. You've got the registers kind of really prominently shrink down to just a very small little section of like 2 POS systems to, you know, buy content and basically either leave or hang out, because in the back of the store you've got a public restroom finally for the people that can be there because they're playing games. There's TV setups, there's retro console setup, and that's how that store is approaching it. That's one of many designs that GameStop is exploring to stay relevant. Now, I know a lot of people are really sour about GameStop. This is, to be honest, is exactly what I expected when they announced a major reshuffle of not only closing some stores, which that's one thing we didn't mention that they did do. Not too long. Well, they announced like either last week or the week before, but they're closing about 200 stores, which really accounts for a very small amount of global GameStop stores. So not a huge deal. Obviously, they're going to cut the fat when they're just hemorrhaging money and they have to try and stay relevant. That's an inevitability. They're going to close stores, but it's a matter of closing stores and finding a new way to keep people in the door. I think this is one of the best approaches. Honestly, I'm going to be a little positive about it and say, you know, even though that this isn't for me, I wouldn't do this, I wouldn't go there, I wouldn't hang out there, that's just not my style, but I know people that would do that. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, this can work in major cities. That's the thing. I liken this to specialty card shops for Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! You know, you've got places like this. And there's not a lot of them, but they're there because that's all you need. You only need one place in a major city to gestate a very large community that can go there, hang out, do local tournaments. That's what they said. That was their outline, is that they want to create a space for people to come out and hang out and purchase content. The thing is, a lot of the storefronts are very small, so I don't think this really is going to work for a lot of them, and I think that's why they've said some will be retro, some will be more focused on like minor esport leagues. which would make sense because then I guess you transform a larger part of the store to be more of a tabletop setup and have a smaller amount for actual countertop space where you're selling your traditional games. But one thing is absolutely certain. I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic in the veins of it'll work in major cities. You can't have a GameStop on every corner anymore. You can't have a GameStop within 30 minutes of each other anymore. And I know that's not the case for every location, but for where I am, we've got like 5 or 6 GameStops. And, you know, Western New York, the Buffalo area, it's not the hugest city in the world. We don't need that many 10 years from now. I guarantee you we're going to have maybe 1 or 2 closures. But we could have 3 or 4 stores that, maybe 4 is pushing it, but we could have stores that stay relevant in this manner, I think. Basically, a lot of people are calling this a last-ditch effort, and yeah, that's what it is, but I wouldn't necessarily down them for it. I think this actually makes a lot of sense. I think this could be a place for people. It remains to be seen, but, you know, it could work, but that's going to be after a lot of store closures. The company's peaked. They're never going to be where they were before. And it's sometimes so hard for a company at that kind of scale to downscale and then stay alive. But that's what they have to do. They just have to not be as valuable of a company as they once were. With all of our news stories out of the way, we can get to Let's Talk, plus the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway where one of you could win a $10 PSN code. I'd like to congratulate Albert Bell. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or Twitter. If you would like to win a $10 PSN code, very simple. Follow the link down below to the Gleam website. Supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and the winner will be announced next week. We do this all the time on Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm trying to pay for your games. Now, with all that out of the way, those are all the news stories I want to talk about you all from this past week. Our Tuesday video was about the coolest, rarest, and most expensive PS4 games ever. Now, I don't know if this was like a YouTube problem. I'm normally not one to like call out YouTube because of a problem or something, but it seems like this video didn't go out to people's sub boxes. Let me know if that happened to you, if you don't know what I'm talking about. Like, oh, I didn't see that video. Like, let me know if you didn't realize that this exists. But otherwise, it's about rare PS4 games. So games that are highly sought after, very low volume, you probably don't have them, but if you do, it's more than likely worth a lot of money. Now, the upcoming Tuesday video, like I mentioned, it's going to be on The Last of Us Day and State of Play, so I don't want to do 2 videos in one day. I know sometimes that happens, but I try to avoid that. So since we know those events are coming, we'll wait for the day to play out. Whatever news happens will happen, and we'll recap it and do a general impressions. And with that, follow on Twitter at Mystic Ryan, where I'll be sending out a tweet saying, you know, question and answer, anything regarding the event or how it played out or what happened. We'll do that accordingly in the video as well, which goes without saying, but because these events are later in the day, you won't get my upload at the usual, whenever it goes up for your time zone. Like, it won't be up, obviously. We have to let the day play out, so just an FYI. Other than that, though, that's it. That concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Benecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.